It's time to talk about your money here on Good Morning Quad Cities. For the past 2.5 years, American households have been struggling against high inflation. But on Wednesday, the U.S. Federal Reserve cautioned Americans that high inflation is expected to last a lot longer. The Federal Reserve is now projecting that high inflation will last another 3 years through the end of 2026. Joining us is our financial expert, Mark Gravicheski from the Quad Cities Investment Group. Good to have you on this Monday.
Hey, morning, Devin. Happy Monday. Great to see you again.
Yes. Now, back in June, inflation had declined to 3%, and there was some hope that maybe this inflation problem was over. But what's changed that the Federal Reserve now expects high inflation to last another 3 years?
Yeah, and Devin, Wall Street certainly, wasn't a big fan of this latest message from the Federal Reserve on Wednesday. But remember, the ultimate goal is to get inflation back down to its target rate of just 2%. Now, from June of 2022 through June of this year in 2023, inflation fell from 8.9% down to 3%. But much of that, Devin, was caused by a decline in energy prices. In fact, if you removed energy prices from the inflation calculation, it showed that outside the realm of lower energy prices, inflation was still quite rampant throughout the rest of the economy. But now those lower energy prices, which again help drive inflation from 8.9% down to 3%, those low energy prices are starting to surge higher again. And that's been driving inflation higher. In July, inflation rose from 3 to 3.2%. 1 month later, in August, inflation goes even higher to 3.7%. And the Federal Reserve, Devin, which again is trying to get this inflation back down to 2%, is starting to realize that inflation is becoming more and more embedded within our economy. And therefore, the Federal Reserve is now projecting that inflation won't get back down to that 2% target rate until the end of 2026, which is another 3 more years.
Right, Mark. So, how are consumers expected to hold up now that inflation is expected to remain high for another 3 years, like you just said?
Yeah, that really is, kind of the big granddaddy of all unknown questions. But look, keep in mind, Devin, consumers have already been struggling with high inflation for 2.5 years. The last time inflation was at or below that 2% target rate was all the way back in February of 2021 when inflation was reported at just 1.7%. This means that by the end of 2026, Americans will have faced nearly 6 consecutive years of high inflation, and high inflation has already taken a punishing toll on households. Savings accounts are dwindling. Household debt, Devin, is at a record high $17 trillion. Within that household debt, Devin, is a record high $1 trillion in credit card debt. And can Americans really weather the storm, so to speak, of 3 more years of high inflation? Look, consumer spending drives more than two-thirds of our nation's total economic growth. But at what point do consumers simply say, look, I'm done. I can't spend anymore. And if consumer spending collapses, Devin, it greatly increases the odds the US economy kind of dips back into a recession.
And Mark, on another note, over the past year and a half, we've seen interest rates steadily climb higher. And what is expected to happen to interest rates in light of the Federal Reserve's new forecast on inflation?
In its attempt to try and get this inflation under control, the Federal Reserve has been aggressively raising interest rates. Now, on Wednesday, obviously, the Fed essentially ramped up its inflation forecast for the next few years. So, as inflation is now expected to remain higher for longer, we should expect those interest rates to also remain higher for longer. This means interest rates on, credit cards, bank loans, car loans, home mortgages will also likely remain high for quite some time. Look, just 2 years ago, Devin, the interest rate on a 30-year mortgage was around 2.5%. Today, the national average rate on that 30-year mortgage is around 7.6%, a 23-year high.
It's hard to hear, but we thank you for breaking down this and putting it into perspective for us.
Great to see you again, Devin. Enjoy the rest of your day and the rest of your week.
All right, you too. Thank you, Mark. And